Hello, everyone. So I'll wait a few seconds to get more viewers, but I hope everyone is having a wonderful day wherever they are in the world. Today, I have a very special guest on our Immersive Trails live stream. And this is the first of two sessions that we're having this week, actually, for Black History Month. So, as part of our live stream series, we've been trying to bring people who want to talk about either work they're doing or research they've done or something like that, and present it to the public via our live stream platform. And the goal is to, as always, make history and heritage and culture more accessible to everyone. And so today I have with me Professor Vivek Bald from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. And I'm not going to give much of an introduction because he can introduce himself, but the topic of today's talk is about movement in the early 1900s between Bengal, undivided Bengal, and the US. And this comes out of research that he's done. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to Tathagat for inviting me to share some of my work. I'll be drawing today on primarily on work that is part of what I've been calling the larger Bengali Harlem project, and specifically from research that is presented in the book Bengali Harlem and the Lost Histories of South Asian America. And this is, as you'll see, a focus on really two early streams of migration from South Asia to the United States, both from each from a different part of Bengal, and from what was then West Bengal, or had just become West Bengal, and the other from the region of that is now part of Bangladesh, including places like Noakhali and Sylhet and Chittagong. So I think without much more further ado, I will just jump into the talk, and we'll have time afterwards for questions as well. So I'll begin. Ellis Island was on fire. The grand 3-story immigration station had cost more than $75,000 and had taken almost 2 years to build. It had been in operation for no more than 5.5 years, and now in the middle of the night on June 15, 1897, a fire had broken out. Hundreds of immigrant detainees were rushed out of the building as the flames spread. Across the water on the southern tip of Manhattan, fire crews scrambled into action, but before their boats could reach the island, the entire pine structure was engulfed in smoke and fire. The ceiling quickly caved in, and the federal government's flagship immigrant processing station collapsed to the ground. 3 days later, the SS St. Louis sailed into New York Harbor from Southampton, England. It was a beautiful early summer evening. The sky was clear and the weather was warm. The St. Louis approached the Statue of Liberty, still a relatively new addition to the waters below Manhattan, and turned gently to the left toward the mouth of the North River. 12 Muslim men from Calcutta and Hooghly, West Bengal, were on board the steamship, preparing to disembark after their 6-day journey across the Atlantic. Ahead and to the ship's right, they would have seen southern Manhattan's impressive outcrop of skyscrapers, the tallest reaching more than 20 stories above the ground, aglow in the evening sun. On their left, where their ship was supposed to dock, lay a pile of rubble. Since the conflagration, the Bureau of Immigration had been scrambling to deal with incoming passenger ships. Each day, two or three more ships arrived bearing thousands of immigrants from Europe and points farther east. In the absence of a processing facility, the Bureau had ordered arriving steamships to proceed to their respective piers along the Manhattan waterfront. A team of medical and immigration inspectors would meet each ship as it docked, examine its passengers, and admit or detain them as warranted. So, after passing the embers of Ellis Island, the St. Louis made its way up the North River to Pier 14, the terminal for its parent company, the American Line. This was one of the largest and most modern structures on the waterfront, extending into the river from West Street between Fulton and Vesey, exactly where a century later the North Tower of the World Trade Center would stand. The Bengali men on board the St. Louis were peddlers, on their way to the beach resorts of New Jersey, Atlantic City, Asbury Park, and Long Branch. In their home villages, their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters produced finely embroidered silk and cotton fabrics, handkerchiefs, bedspreads, pillow covers, and tablecloths in a style known as chikon. No doubt, the luggage that each man carried was filled with such goods. The 12 men had made their way by ship from Calcutta to Southampton, England. They had then crossed the Atlantic in the SS St. Louis with more than 200 other migrants, immigrants, and travelers. They shared the cramped quarters of third class with a German butcher, an Armenian student, a Japanese cook, 2 Russian Jewish tailors, and a number of returning Americans, a dressmaker, a cigar worker, a cattleman, and a upholsterer. More than half the passengers were Scandinavian immigrants on their way to New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Minnesota, and North Dakota. The majority of these men and women were farmers, laborers, and domestic workers. What were the Bengali peddlers anticipating as their ship docked on West Street? The older members of the group had been making voyages to the United States since the 1880s. In recent years, a few of the peddlers had passed through Ellis Island's imposing new processing facility and made their way through its maze of metal pens, going from one type of inspection to the next. The men likely knew what to expect as they faced the indignity of the medical examination, in which they were poked and prodded like cattle, their hair combed through for lice, their eyelids pulled back with a metal hook to check for trachoma. But the number of questions that the immigration examiners asked had been increasing, and the speed at which they were asked these questions had grown more rapid. And in the days following the Ellis Island fire, the examiners were no doubt under pressure to be extra vigilant, to prove that the adverse conditions would not hamper their ability to prevent undesirable aliens from entering the country. When Mintos and Musha Mondol, Moqsed Ali, their colleagues Abdul Aziz, Abdul Ahmed, Basiruddin, Obidullah, and Fazle Rahman went up before the examiner, they gave a single set of answers to a quick succession of questions. Occupation, merchant. Nationality, East Indian. Last residence, Southampton. Final destination, New Jersey. Who paid for your ticket? Myself. How much money do you have with you? £6. Been in the United States before? Yes. Joining a relative? No. Been in prison? No. Polygamist? No. Under contract to work in the United States? To this last question, they all answered no, or at least this is what was recorded on the incoming ship's manifest. But something must have happened when the men were face to face with the immigration examiner. Something was said, something was misunderstood, someone hesitated, or the examiner simply decided that the dozen Indians were suspicious, that they looked like contract workers entering the country in violation of the law. He ordered them detained. As the Scandinavian farmers and workers disembarked onto West Street to start new lives, meet eagerly waiting relatives, or make their way to points farther west, the 12 Muslim peddlers from Bengal were taken away to the southern tip of Manhattan to a makeshift detention center on the top floor of the barge office, a facility that one contemporary reporter described as grimy, gloomy, and more suggestive of an enclosure for animals than a receiving station for prospective citizens. Across the water, a few miles down the New Jersey coast, the beach boardwalks were filling up with thousands of summer vacationers, thousands of potential customers for the fancy goods that sat packed away in the peddlers' trunks. But this summer's trip was not to be. After holding them in detention for 8 days, the Bureau of Immigration's Board of Special Inquiry ordered the 12 men deported, declaring that, quote, inasmuch as they peddle goods not their own, they are held to come under provisions of the contract labor law, end quote. On the ship that took them back to London, the men were now listed as laborers, not merchants. What is remarkable about this story is not the harshness of the treatment to which the 12 Bengali peddlers were subjected, or the cursory nature of the Board of Inquiry hearing that turned them back from US shores. In the closing years of the 19th century, as the numbers of immigrants arriving at US ports swelled, the federal government had taken over the processing and evaluation of arriving passengers, a role previously played by individual states. The government's Immigration Bureau began rationalizing, regularizing, and tightening the criteria according to which alien passengers would be admitted. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Alien Contract Labor Law of 1885 were two of the first elements of the new border regime. Both were suffused with racist assumptions about the nature of Asian laborers, and both complicated the Bengali peddlers' ability to cross into the United States, making their treatment in 1897, at the very least, unsurprising. What was remarkable was the peddlers' ability to adapt to their deportation and operate within a much larger field of possibilities. Within a month of their arrival in London, 5 of the deported men, Musha Mondal, Basiruddin, Abdulaziz, Abdul Ahmed, and Obidullah, signed on with a group of 50 miners from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern and Eastern Europe, and set off by a steamer for South Africa, which, along with Australia, was another market for their goods. Within a year or two, almost all 12 men would return to the United States, traveling in smaller groups, trying different ports, finding a way to get back in, to reunite with kin and co-villagers, and carry on their work. These men were part of what may be the first long-term settlement of South Asians in the United States. Beginning sometime in the 1880s, Muslim peddlers from a cluster of villages just north of Kolkata began traveling to the United States to sell Oriental goods, embroidered cotton and silk, small rugs, perfumes, and a range of other items. Indian demand for their handicrafts had declined under colonial rule, as the British flooded Indian markets with their cheap factory-made textiles and pushed to establish greater control over the subcontinent's internal markets. But overseas, middle-class consumers in Britain, Australia, South Africa, and the United States were in the grip of a fin de siècle fashion for the exotic goods of India and the East. Other Indian traders from the region of Sindh had already begun to move outward from the subcontinent in order to cater to the demand for Oriental goods among the growing number of European tourists and travelers in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The Bengalis followed suit, but ventured into new territories, establishing an extensive network that stretched through New York to the beach boardwalk resorts of New Jersey, then southward to the bustling tourist markets of New Orleans and Charleston, across a series of other southern US cities, and into the Caribbean basin to Cuba, Belize, and Panama. Even as US laws and attitudes turned against Asian immigrants, these men worked the India craze to their advantage. Between the 1890s and the 1920s, as the policing of Asian immigration tightened, these men built upon regional and kinship ties to expand their operations. In their own day, they became a regular fixture at North American tourist sites and on the streets of major US cities, yet they have vanished from historical memory. 10 years after the dozen peddlers on the SS St. Louis were detained and deported on a Sunday morning at the end of December 1907, a different set of Indian Muslim men appeared on the waters of New York Harbor. Several small groups set out in rowboats from piers all over the area, from the east side and west side docks of Manhattan, and from the waterfronts of Brooklyn, Staten Island, and New Jersey. In the brisk winter morning air, the men rowed south and eastward across New York's crowded, choppy waterways, weaving past freighters, tramps, schooners, and ferries toward bush docks in southern Brooklyn. There, at the edge of the neighborhood now known as Sunset Park, they climbed onto the upper deck of a German steamship, the Stolzenfels, where they prepared for a Muslim holy day. These men were sailors, or more precisely, maritime laborers. They were stokers, firemen, coal trimmers, and stewards from various steamships that were then in port. Over the course of the day, groups of these seamen, lascars, as the British called them, kept turning up in one small boat after another. By the time of the ceremony and feast, 50 Indian Muslim men had arrived from every part of the New York waterfront and were gathered on the deck of the Stolzenfels. A crowd that included the ship's European officers, a press photographer, and a New York Times reporter stood at a distance to watch. The reporter's story appeared prominently on page 3 of the Times the next morning. His narration of the sailors' activities was a mixture of fantasy, newspeak, and condescension. For hours before the beginning of the feast, the Times reporter wrote, little Lascar sailors came. The South Brooklyn Pier at the foot of 42nd Street was the Mecca toward which the Lascars headed. The little brown sailors squatted on the forward deck of the German freighter, and the sheep's head was pointed to the sun. It was then massaged by one of the Lascars until those who viewed the ceremony from the bridge felt sure that the sheep was hypnotized. Quick as a wink, the animal was dispatched, and before any of the flesh was touched, every drop of blood in the animal had been allowed to trickle into a pan on the deck. While this was going on, the band played the sacred music incidental to the Feast of the Mala. The music sounded to American ears much like that heard at Coney Island sideshows. This was just one of a number of stories that appeared in US newspapers at the turn of the 20th century, describing the arrival of strange and curious Hindu sailors in port cities along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Riding from the marginal spaces of the United States docklands and waterfronts in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Galveston, reporters ushered Lascars onto the terrain of the US popular imagination. To American readers at the turn of the century, Indian seamen might as well have been fictional characters. Judging by the press reports of the day, they were equal parts exotic and peculiar, inscrutable and fanatical, ridiculous and treacherous. At the same time, these articles offer us a glimpse into the lives that this population of workers from the subcontinent were fashioning for themselves as they spent days, weeks, and months in US ports, waiting for their ships to unload, reload, and set back out to sea. Most poignant were the accounts of Indian seamen who were faced with burying comrades who had died during their ship's voyages. Even the most voyeuristic descriptions of these moments hint at the care that the seamen took to prepare their co-workers' bodies in accordance with Muslim practice and to maintain the privacy and dignity of burial rites in unfamiliar and unsympathetic surroundings. One account, focusing on the death of an Indian steamship cook, described a, quote, weird ceremony at New York's Bellevue Hospital in which, quote, each of the friends of the deceased removed his shoes and stockings and taking a pail of water, sat down on the curb outside the morgue door and bathed his feet, end quote. Even the New York Times 1907 account of the, quote, Feast of the Mala, with its demeaning descriptions of little brown men performing like a Coney Island sideshow, revealed that Indian seamen were organized and determined enough to secure the use of the upper deck of the Stolzenfels for their observances, and then to communicate and coordinate among Muslim crew members on multiple ships spread across several miles of New York waterfront. In the years that the US operations of the Hooghly peddler network were slowing down, Indian seamen were arriving in Atlantic ports in increasing numbers. New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia were at the edge of a maritime world that stretched far beyond the comprehension of local American newsmen. The events that had compelled and enabled Hooghly's peddlers of silks to cross oceans, the expansion of the British Empire, the opening of the Suez Canal, the arrival of steam power, and the growth and acceleration of world travel and trade, had also given rise to a new industrial workforce on the subcontinent, one that was semi-captive and hyper-exploited, but globally mobile. In the early decades of the 20th century, Indians came to comprise almost 1/4 of the laborers on British merchant vessels. They moved through the circuits of British seaborne trade and became a regular presence in and around port cities from Asia to the Middle East to Britain and beyond. The majority of these men came from rural areas, many from smallholding farming families whose livelihoods had been disrupted by colonial taxation policies. In their villages and on the waterfronts of Calcutta and Bombay, there were thousands of other men like them, waiting for months or even years to find work on outgoing steamships. They had to take out loans to pay middlemen in order to get hired, and then at sea they faced indenture-like contracts and brutal conditions at the hands of British masters. Even in this setting, however, Indian seamen developed strategies to challenge the industry's inequities and improve their lives, from mutiny to black marketeering to jumping ship in ports overseas. By the 1910s, tens of thousands of these Indian seamen were working globally on British ships. Thousands were moving into and out of the port of New York each year, and hundreds were successfully jumping ship and disappearing into the crowded waterfronts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. Some deserted in order to find better work and wages on other ships. Others deserted to find jobs in factories and restaurants on shore. Their journey to the United States was remarkable because of the arduousness of the labor they had to perform. Many shoveling coal and firing furnaces in the bellies of steamships on and off shift continuously for more than 80 hours a week, and for the policing and ill treatment they faced from their British captains and officers on board. After 1917, those who reached the United States also faced a harsh new immigration regime, one that barred their entry into the country on explicitly racial grounds. But Indian seamen continued to escape into the United States. As was the case with Hooghly's peddlers, they did so through a combination of ingenuity, cooperation, and coordination, building networks of their countrymen onshore and at sea. Indian seamen, ex-seamen, and sympathizers passed information to one another, helped one another jump ship, and found one another work, often far from their ports of desertion across the industrial belt of the US Midwest. They first deserted in large numbers during World War I, when there was a demand for their labor in US munitions, shipbuilding, and steel factories. But once they had established their networks, Indian seamen branched out to a wide range of onshore labor, working not only as steel workers in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, and Youngstown, Ohio, but as silk dyers in Paterson, New Jersey, assembly line workers in the auto industry in Detroit, and as cooks, dishwashers, doormen, and elevator operators in New York City. The stories of these two groups of migrants complicate the analytical frameworks that have thus far shaped our understanding of South Asian American history. The frameworks of exclusion, immigration, and diaspora. Asian exclusion has dominated the South Asian American narrative during this era, bringing some histories to the foreground while leaving others unexplored. In considering the early 20th century, for example, South Asian American scholars have focused their attention on the Punjabi Sikh farmers and mill workers who were the most visible targets of exclusion efforts in California and the Pacific Northwest between 1900 and 1920, who bore the brunt of the violence and vitriol of West Coast nativists, and who in some cases fought the exclusion laws in the courts. But as we have focused our attention on these groups, the presence of other Indian migrants who did not fight but rather found ways to navigate around the exclusion laws has remained somewhat obscured. At the same time, exclusion has skewed our understanding of the timeline of South Asian immigration, because the 1917 Immigration Act, which barred the entry of migrants from Asia, was so severe, scholars have treated the act, along with the subsequent Supreme Court decision in US versus Bhagat Singh Thind, as if it were a door slamming shut. The narrative of South Asian migration to the US thus tends to skip several decades. It only picks up again after 1965, when the doors of immigration were opened up again, this time to a more select group of South Asians, doctors, engineers, and professionals. The common wisdom has been that in the period between 1917 and 1965, there was little to no significant migration from the Indian subcontinent to the United States. This has meant that those who did come during the exclusion era and who lived under the radar of the immigration laws have remained unknown and unconsidered. At the same time, the framing concept of immigration has shaped who we see and who we do not see as part of South Asian American history. The iconic, and some would say mythic, story of 20th century immigration to the US is one in which groups of people leave their homeland behind in search of a better life in the United States, reconstitute their families and communities in ethnic enclaves, little Italies, little Indias, then gradually accumulate wealth, move out to the suburbs, educate their children, and ultimately become ethnic or hyphenated Americans. The migrants I've been looking at did not follow this trajectory. Most of the Bengali peddlers and seamen were not immigrants at all, but sojourners for whom the United States was not a final destination, let alone an answer or a deliverance. Most moved into and through the US as they navigated global circuits of commerce and labor, staying in the US for months or years at a time, but eventually returning to the subcontinent. The smaller number who did settle in the US permanently were not welcomed, celebrated, or embraced by the nation, nor did they form ethnic enclaves. They have therefore remained outside the standard frame of immigration, and because of this, we have missed something crucial. The fact that these Muslim migrants from South Asia found alternate spaces of possibility and life-making in African-American neighborhoods, in Treme, New Orleans, in Black Bottom, Detroit, and in Harlem. In the case of Hooghly's Chikondars, the 1900 US Census provides us with an early snapshot of these dynamics. On the day that the census was recorded in 1900, Hero Sheikh, who had arrived from Calcutta with 10 other peddlers in 1896, was now living in a lodging house for Southern Black migrants in Pittsburgh. Abdul Latif was renting a room from an African-American family in Cleveland, Ohio, and Raheem Bucks lived in an all-Black neighborhood in the seaside town of St. Augustine, Florida. Abdul Sukar was peddling goods in Houston, Texas, where he had married a young African-American woman named Sadie. At the turn of the century, everywhere the Bengalis peddled their goods, they lived in working-class African-American homes, apartment buildings, and neighborhoods. There was no city more important to their operations than New Orleans, which gave them access by train to other southern sites and by ship to the Caribbean and Central America. But they came to New Orleans as Jim Crow was being imposed both through laws and through extra-legal violence. And from the moment they arrived, they lived among the city's residents of African descent, both Southern Black migrants and Creoles of color. Between 1895 and 1930, the Bengalis made their homes almost entirely in the neighborhood of Treme. Some of the men established group households and boarding houses in a handful of neighborhood residences that then provided shelter for dozens of fellow members of the Hooghly network, cousins, uncles, nephews, and co-villagers. Others married into local communities, starting families with Creole of color women and women connected to the more recent African-American in-migration to New Orleans. Still others appear to have moved from one residence to another over decades spent cycling in and out of New Orleans, but always lived within the bounds of Treme. The most important residence for the network's operations was 1428 St. Louis Street, a two-story wooden structure on a predominantly Black working-class block on the edge between New Orleans' semi-legal sex district Storyville and the rest of Treme. This is where possibly the first Bengali to settle in New Orleans, Aleph Ali, lived with his Creole of color partner, Emily Lecomte, and their two daughters, Viola and Mary Sadie, as early as 1893. By the 1910s, after Emily's death, Aleph Ali turned 1428 St. Louis Street into a boarding house for other members of the peddler network, and it continued to operate in this capacity at least until the late 1920s. In the latter part of this period, after the start of the First World War and the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act, the Bengalis' global operations began to wane. But those men who remained in New Orleans moved further into the heart of Treme, where they married and started families and became a part of a growing Black commercial district along North Claiborne Avenue. Here they opened shops selling dresses, suits, and other cloth goods to local African-American residents. The seamen who jumped ship from the 1910s to 1940s followed a similar trajectory into Black neighborhoods. Most of the escaped seamen who found their way to Detroit to work on Ford's assembly lines lived in a series of Indian boarding houses and group households in a corner of the working-class African-American neighborhood of Black Bottom, on the east side of downtown. On their immediate blocks, their neighbors were predominantly Greek, Arab, Afghan, and Syrian immigrants. 3 or 4 blocks to the north, however, was one of Black Bottom's main entertainment and commercial districts, around St. Antoine Street and Gratiot Avenue, which was home to a variety of African-American small businesses, nightclubs, restaurants, and vaudeville and movie theaters. On the blocks beyond, to the north, east, and south, were the residential areas of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, where, as a result of the city's segregation, up to 300,000 Southern Black migrants came to share some of Detroit's poorest housing. In the 1920s, one of the ex-seamen opened a small Indian restaurant here, possibly Detroit's first, which became a place of congregation for the city's workers from the subcontinent. As in New Orleans, a small number of the ex-seamen married local African-American women and moved from the immigrant rooming house district further into the heart of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. It was Harlem, however, where the largest community of South Asian ex-seamen settled in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Harlem during this period is best known as the epicenter of the African-American world. As thousands of African Americans joined the Great Migration in the opening decades of the 20th century, Harlem became the neighborhood of all Northern Black neighborhoods. Quote, "To many oppressed within the limitations set up by the South," wrote Ray Stannard Baker in 1910, quote, "it is indeed the promised land," end quote. But Harlem was not just an endpoint for Southern migration. It was a destination for immigrants from other parts of the Black diasporic world. By the time the first handful of Indian Muslim seamen moved uptown in the mid-1910s, the neighborhood around them was being transformed by thousands of immigrants from the English and Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The ex-seamen from the subcontinent were just a drop amid these larger streams of migrants, but they were one of several such smaller groups quietly settling into the uptown neighborhood, including Argentinians, Colombians, Mexicans, Panamanians, and Chinese. As they joined the flow into Harlem, South Asian Muslims became an important, if now forgotten, part of New York City and its uptown neighborhood. Many commuted downtown each day, crowded into subway trains with their African American, Puerto Rican, and West Indian neighbors, and worked beside them in restaurants, hotels, and factories. Others sold hot dogs from pushcarts along Harlem's main thoroughfares, Lexington Avenue, 110th Street, 116th Street. A handful saved enough money to open Indian restaurants in different parts of the neighborhood, and a few opened establishments in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. By the 1940s, members of this population, who were predominantly from the maritime sending regions of East Bengal, Noakhali, and Sylhet, established their own association, their clubhouse, and spaces of daily gathering. They became part of a heterogeneous Muslim community in Harlem, which included African Americans and immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. And, as had happened in New Orleans and Detroit, a smaller number of these ex-seamen married women from their adopted neighborhood, creating together a unique, if short-lived, multiracial community. The structure and the functioning of peddlers and seamen's networks, and the small communities they left behind, point us to the central role not just of Black neighborhoods, but of Puerto Rican, African American, and West Indian women, in what might at first glance be seen simply as an early manifestation of a South Asian diaspora. Evidence of these women's labor and importance is scattered through archives and family stories. In the 1910 US Census record for Alif Ali's boarding house in New Orleans, for example, reveals the presence of a widowed 65-year-old African-American woman, Celestine Gardner, living among the house's 20 Bengali peddlers and almost certainly performing the labor of cooking, cleaning, laundering, and caring for Alaf Ali's daughter, Viola. This pattern of one woman living in a boarding house full of Indian and other immigrant men recurs within the networks formed by ex-seamen in Detroit. The 1930 census shows that many of the auto workers' boarding houses in Black Bottom, Syrian, Afghan, and Indian, were structured in this way, including 584 Fort Street, an Indian-run rooming house in which Marguerite Ali, the Mexican wife of one of the residents, was working as the boarding house's housemaid. African-American women also figure in a number of ship jumpers' stories as boarding house keepers, as allies who hid the men, fed and sheltered them until their ships left port and other Indian ex-seamen could find them jobs and more permanent places to live. In some cases, the wives of Indian peddlers and ex-seamen also became their business partners, helping them set up and run small restaurants and shops. In New York City in the mid-1940s, Habib Ullah and Victoria Echevarria Ullah together ran one of the city's earliest Indian restaurants, the Bengal Garden, on 46th Street near Times Square. Habib was an ex-seaman from Noakhali in East Bengal, who had jumped ship in the 1920s and then worked for years as a dishwasher and cook in New York restaurants and lunch counters. Victoria had emigrated from Puerto Rico on her own in the 1930s, worked in factories, and put herself through beautician school. The Bengal Garden was built on their respective strengths. Habib, who was literate in neither Bangla nor English, but had years of experience in commercial kitchens throughout the city, handled the back-up house, while Victoria, who had developed a knack for business, oversaw the wait staff, greeted customers, and took care of the money and the books. Marriage brokering was another arena of female labor that was crucial to the establishment of Indian ex-Maritime communities in New York City. One woman who played this role was Frenchie Abdul, the wife of a South Asian ex-seaman named Abbas Abdul. In the 1940s and 50s, Abbas and Frenchie worked together to assist dozens of Bengali ship jumpers. After putting them up, Abbas would help find them jobs while Frenchie would broker marriages through which they could gain a stronger footing and eventually gain legal status. According to their daughter, quote, "It was a running joke that in Sylhet and Noakhali, people would give out my parents' address. If you ever want to stay in New York, when you leave the ship, just go to their house. Here's their address." And the people would come. And immigration would also come to the neighborhood. And my parents taught us at a young age, if somebody comes up to you, a man comes up to you in the street and shows you a picture, even if it's Chacha or somebody, you don't know them. Don't talk to the strangers. You don't know anybody. On a broader level, intermarriage itself played a key role in the formation and functioning of South Asian networks. The African American, Puerto Rican, and other women in such marriages, whether in New York, Detroit, or New Orleans, facilitated South Asian men's settlement into US cities and integration into local economic circuits and existing working class communities of color. And in so doing, anchored the networks through which peddlers sold their goods and through which seamen escaped their ships and found work on shore. Through their domestic and reproductive labor, through their local knowledge and connections, through their cultural and linguistic fluency, they provided the stable locations throughout South Asian networks for seamen both to settle and to circulate. These early histories of Bengali migration help us to see neighborhoods such as Jermay, Black Bottom, and Harlem in an expanded light. At the very least, These should be understood as sites that are important to South Asian American history, alongside the more obvious locations where ethnic enclaves developed much later in the century. However, the South Asian stories lived out in neighborhoods of the Black diaspora, on their streets and in their shotgun houses, tenements, and apartment buildings, also point to something crucial and often overlooked about these places themselves. These neighborhoods, so central to the cultural, political, and everyday life of African American, Creole, and Caribbean communities in the first half of the 20th century, were also spaces of great multiplicity that fostered interactions, intermixtures, and a shared, if often contested, sense of belonging that was crafted in the give and take between different working class migrants of color, none of whom were able to access fully the national promise of inclusion. It is important not to idealize these spaces and their processes of collective placemaking. These were also sites marked by competition, division, and at times intergroup violence. But the stories of conflict have been told often and have often overshadowed other experiences and dynamics. They are more dramatic and serve to confirm assumptions about the supposed incapacities of neighborhoods and communities of color. But in fact, these neighborhoods and communities prove to be some of the only ones in the United States with the capacity to take in South Asian Muslim peddlers and seamen, to provide them with the possibility of establishing lives, livelihoods, homes, and home bases when their own regions were under colonial domination and when the United States sought only to criminalize and exclude them. What these and other migrants of color found in Black diasporic neighborhoods was what George Lipsitz, drawing on the African-American religious scholar Theophilus Smith, has called a, quote, world-traversing and world-transcending citizenship, forged by peoples, quote, cut off from ancestral homelands and denied full franchise and social membership in the United States, end quote. Denied national belonging themselves, South Asian Muslims found the means to make their lives in these places at the United States racialized margins, bypassing a national membership that was denied to them, and instead forging connections that were simultaneously local and transnational. Here, they depended not just on their own tenacity and kinship networks, but also on the knowledge, labor, and partnership of other migrants and residents of color. Their stories suggest that Black neighborhoods fostered different possibilities for South Asian migrants, gave rise to different registers of community and affiliation, and allowed for very different forms of immigrant assimilation and integration. Thanks.
That was very fascinating. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I can see in the comments that a lot of people are are agreeing with me that it's very fascinating and something that nobody had heard of before. Yes, for example. So we wanted to share something that we've come across in our research. So we have a walk on World War II in Calcutta, and we actually found this individual called Miha Musaddar, who was a Muslim janitor who enlisted in the U.S. Army, and he was in the European theater. But he actually had the U.S. military find his family in Bengal and go give them money.
Wow.
Like his, whatever would be sent to the families. So there's actually newspaper reports from the local army newspaper of that time in this theater, and we even have a picture of it, I believe. So we just thought this was really cool, and I think it really fits in with what you are talking about. So maybe maybe you might be able to find out some more about him and what he was doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And you know, as we were talking about offline, you know, there's so much of the South Asian side of this history that resides in places like Kolkata, that has been, you know, barely tapped in terms of you know, potential archival sources, as well as just families who have connections to these 100-year-old history.
Yeah. Yes. So Arihant asks, were they instrumental to modern U.S. industrialization?
Well, they were, you know, what initially I think provided the possibility for the networks to expand in the 1910s was the First World War, and the fact that U.S. factories were in a phase of war production, and a lot of the young men who would have been working in those factories were in the armed services. And so this is something that has been documented as sort of a moment where more women, more African Americans, more you know, other folks of color who had been sort of excluded by the white working class had opportunities to be working in these factories. And among that, in that context, factory workers actually, or factory managers and middlemen actually started recruiting Indian and Chinese sailors or ship workers on the waterfronts and inducing them to jump ship to come, you know, work in factories. This is, I think, particularly the case with the silk dyeing industry in Patterson, because that was a place that was just not far from the waterfront where they could jump ship. There's also records of the South Asian and Chinese ex-seamen being sort of used as a buffer between the factory owners and the unions that were dominated by white working class men. And so, you know, as is very common in U.S. labor history, you know, the factory owners used race and immigration status as a way to divide the workers. So South Asian and Chinese ship workers ended up kind of in the middle of those dynamics after having been recruited off the waterfronts. But also, you know, this became sort of a point that came up in the late 1930s and early 1940s. There was a moment where a number of folks from, you know, what was then still colonial India, or British colonial India, were advocating in U.S. Congress for a couple of different things. One was to regularize the citizenship status, or create a pathway to citizenship for, you know, roughly 3,000 or 4,000 South Asian or Indian men who had settled in the U.S. In the early part of the century, and who were at that point living as undocumented immigrants. And the other part was to put India on a quota system to allow the beginnings of like more migration, immigration, legal immigration, and citizenship. And in these efforts, these lobbying efforts in U.S. Congress, there were a number of sort of more, I would say, you know, more elite Indian Americans who had settled in the U.S., who were kind of going to Congress, making certain arguments about like the contribution of Indian scientists and opening up lines of Indian business exchange and things like that. But one of the ex-ship workers, Ibrahim Chowdhury, who was from Sylhet, and who had become sort of the leader of the ex-maritime community in New York City, testified in front of Congress saying, I'm not here to speak for all those other folks, the business people and the students, people who are going to come and go. I'm here to speak about the workers, the laborers. And he, specifically in that context of lobbying Congress for changes in the immigration laws, and specifically for regularizing the status of all of those undocumented workers, was really, applying to the Congress people's sense of the Indian participation in the industrial war effort, right? So that became actually a point of lobbying from the standpoint of one of the few people who was representing working class Indian or South Asian migrants.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so Shomarpun asks, what language would they have been communicating in with their partners or with other people in their local communities when they were living in the U.S.?
Well, that's very difficult to say at this point. One of the challenges when I was doing the research about the peddlers, the Hooghly peddlers who settled in New Orleans, was that by the time I was looking at these archival documents, we were already about 4 or 5 generations away from, in most cases, from those original men who came from Hooghly and settled. Whereas with the ship workers, there are still many children of Bengali, African American, Bengali, Puerto Rican families from the New York area. There's still many children who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So from that side, in that part of the history, it was easier to get a sense of the actual day-to-day dynamics and these questions about language and how people kind of communicated across various different cultural and linguistic and religious differences, etc. But on the New Orleans case, it's a bit more difficult to figure that part out. Like a lot of what I was trying to figure out, and this is really in the first 2 chapters of the book, came from connecting the dots of multiple different archival documents and trying to see, well, for example, when I was trying to get a sense of the nature of the marriages, were they just short-lived and like marriages of convenience, or were they longer-lived? I would find, for example, a Bengali peddler living with his African-American wife in one census, like in 1900, and then in 1910, I would find that African-American wife living back with her parents and with a child, and the man was nowhere to be found, right? So there were some cases like that where you could kind of make some, get some understanding of what the dynamic of that particular marriage was and what that meant for the woman who was involved in that marriage. And then there were other cases where, like in the case of Sofor Ali and America Ali, who was of Cuban and Creole descent. They had, I think, 6 or 7 children. They lived the rest of their lives together. And there are actually now, after the book has come out, I've discovered that there are some descendants who are in New Orleans still, and that's part of the process of the project right now, is starting to connect with some more of those people.
That sounds great. So just one more question before we have to wrap up here.
Okay.
So what was the relationship between these groups and the ones that came later in the 60s and 70s? And how much of this history was known in Bengal, or was it completely forgotten that these earlier flows had existed? You kind of mentioned that a little bit in terms of the scholarly research, but what was the more general feeling?
Yeah. I mean, my sense of I'll take the second part of that question first, but my sense of how much was known is that these histories, especially because on the U.S. side, it was majority, in most cases, the immigrants, the migrants were living undocumented and had sort of a necessity, in the case of the ship workers in particular, necessity not to be found by officially, right? That the histories have lived on within individual families, right? So on the U.S. side, African American, Puerto Rican families, and to some extent, some of the Bangladeshi families that came after, the late 60s and early 70s, and then more in the when Bangladesh was put on a different visa system in the late 80s, that within those communities, Bangladeshi communities in the New York area, I do keep coming across families who say, yeah, once when they arrived, they knew that they already had this one uncle who'd been here for 30 years and was married to an African American woman or Puerto Rican woman. So there was definitely knowledge within the community here, and I'm assuming also in those communities. I mean, there's areas in Sylhet and Hooghly, of course, where the amount of back and forth between those areas and Britain, those areas in the U.S., those areas in other parts of the world, those have been ongoing for a long time, and there's a whole remittance economy that has existed for a couple generations. So, there's clear knowledge in those places for sure. These aren't histories that have been forgotten for the most part, among those who are connected to them. But that is one of the fears that the older folks who I've met in New York, who are the children of these early mixed marriages, it is a fear that they have that their grandchildren, for example, will completely forget or won't believe that this even happened or whatever. And so there's a sort of imperative to keep these histories alive.
That's interesting.
Well,
and what was the first part of the question?
Yeah, the first part of the question. The question about the relationship between this earlier folks from this earlier migration and those who came after 1965 when the immigration laws changed. It's kind of it's a question that I've wrangled with a lot over the course of this project, and it's, to me, it seems clear that if you were coming here from India in the late 60s and early 70s, right, as part of that more professional, wave of professionals, engineers, etc., you would have almost had to have been aware of, to some extent, that this earlier migration existed, because the majority of Indian restaurants that existed in New York City in 1965, in the early 70s, were run by Bengali Muslim men who were steamship workers and had jumped ship and gone through that whole kind of process of eventually working their way into having a small business. And so my sense is that among that first group that came post 65, there must have been some understanding that this earlier migration existed, but for whatever reason, whether it was about class, whether it was about religion, whether it was about the fact that these men had sort of married into other communities of color, and there's sort of this idea that they were, there may have been this idea that they were no longer part of a South Asian community in the way that the new immigrants were imagining, right? So there's issues of race, class, religion, region that likely played into a sort of maybe bracketing out of these earlier histories by the professionals, the engineers, etc., who came post 1965. That's my own sense of things.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again. And thank you everyone for listening. The next Black History Month live stream that we will be doing. Yeah. And this one is a very special comment. Thank you very much, Shreya.
So the history is all around you.
Yeah. So the next live stream that we'll be doing for Black History Month is on the 28th at 8 p.m. Indian time. And that is a very special presentation by 3 scholars talking about their research with the Siddi community, which is a Black community who have lived in India for generations, and they'll talk a little bit about their heritage and how they fit into Indian society now. So that'll be a really interesting talk, and I hope you all can join us for that as well. Same place, same time on the 28th. So thank you very much indeed, and have a good evening, everyone in India, and a good day for everyone elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.